You ready to ride, Book?
Yeah.
Put your helmet on. Are you scared?
No.
What if you fall?
I know you will catch me.
Tell when you're ready. Ready?
Ready.
Okay, let's do it. I've noticed a rather interesting quality in ministries and leaders that have it. It's a quality you might not expect, and that is they are absolutely and completely willing to fail. As I've studied those who have it, the leaders, they're typically full of faith. They've got this kind of divine sense of courage. They're willing to venture out into places that others haven't gone. They're willing to try things that others have never tried. And because of this kind of daring, adventurous spirit, they often succeed. But in reality, they often fail. But even in their failures, they seem to learn and to adjust and to take what came from those failures, and those failures seem somehow to often lead to significant breakthroughs. Take the opposite, though. Those ministries or leaders that don't have it, surprisingly, they're afraid to fail. They tend to play it safe. They often do only what they know is going to work because they're paralyzed with a fear of failure. It's a little bit like the parable that Jesus told in Matthew 25. He said there was a master who handed out talents, different amounts of talents to different people. To one guy he gave 5 talents, to another guy he gave 2 talents, and to another guy he gave 1 talent. The 2 guys that had the most, the 5 and the 2, they were willing to fail. They took a risk. They took what they had, they went out and they invested it, knowing the whole time their investment may or may not pay off. And because of their willingness to fail, they doubled what they had. The master was very happy. The third guy, though, he only had 1 talent, and he, like so many of us, he was afraid to fail. He didn't want to let anybody down, so he went and buried his talent in the ground and didn't do anything with it. The fear of failure limited his future, and the master was not happy with him at all. Those leaders who have it, they're willing to fail. Those that don't have it, they tend to play it safe. Reminds me of Buki. We have 6 children. Buki is my 5th child. His real name is Stephen Craig, but when he was a baby, his big brother called him Booby, which was totally unacceptable to us, so we renamed him Buki. Buki told me recently, he said, "Daddy, I want to ride a bike. I want to learn to ride a bike." And so as we tried to learn to ride the bike, Buki often failed, because failing is often a big part of success. When we think about the early disciples of Jesus, there was one in particular that seemed to fail most often. His name was Peter. You can remember in one of the early encounters that Peter had with Jesus, Jesus was explaining that one day he was going to have to die, to give his life and then be raised again. And Peter couldn't stand that. He argued, "No, that can't happen to you. I'm not going to let it. That'll never happen." And Jesus looked at Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan." Peter failed miserably. Another time when Peter and the other disciples were out on a boat, Jesus came walking up on water, and Peter was like, "Man, that is so cool. Jesus, is that you? Can I do that as well?" And Jesus said, "Yeah, get out of the boat." And so Peter took a step over the edge of the boat and miraculously walked on water until he took his eyes off Jesus. When he looked and saw the wind and the waves, he became freaked out and he started to sink. Once again, Peter failed. Another time, whenever Jesus was about to be arrested by the Roman soldiers, again, Peter said, "No, that's not going to happen." He drew his sword and he swung at a Roman soldier's head, and he missed it, clipped his ear, and the ear fell on the ground, and Jesus must have been like, "There you go again, Peter. Now I got to go heal this guy's ear." Peter failed again. But the big one was when 3 different times people asked Peter, "Do you know who Jesus is?" And Peter's like, "Jesus who? Never heard of him." And 3 times Peter denied Christ, and then the rooster crowed. Peter, the failure. The beautiful part of the story is after the resurrection of Jesus, he had another encounter with Peter, and this time he showed Peter this absolute forgiveness, grace, and love. "Peter, do you love me? Then feed my sheep." And when Peter experienced the grace of Jesus after his failure, God did something on the inside of Peter that allowed him to be the guest speaker on the day of Pentecost. Peter, the forgiven failure, who learned through all of his mistakes and experienced the true grace of Jesus, was able to preach in a way that few others could have ever preached. And 3,000 people were saved. Why? Because God used a failure named Peter. Sometimes you have to try and fail and learn and adjust. You try, you fail, you learn, you adjust. You try, you fail, you learn, you adjust. And before long, through your failures, God does something very, very special. You're doing it. You're the man, baby.
Oh, I'm okay.
One of my favorite churches in the world is one that was built on faith risks. These wild and crazy believers, they were willing to try all sorts of things. Sometimes they'd succeed, sometimes they'd fail. And when they'd fail, they'd learn from it. And it was a church built on faith risks and a willingness to fail. Well, I was meeting with some of the leaders one time recently, and I said, hey, have you guys ever considered trying this? And they said, oh, that's too big of a risk. I'm like, well, why is that a risk? And they said, Craig, when you get to be our size, failure's not an option. And I wanted to cry out, no, don't tell me that, because you guys were built on taking faith risks. Don't play it safe now. Don't become conservative. You always have to be willing to bet the farm. That's why I always teach our staff and our leaders that, yeah, failure is not an option. It's an absolute necessity. You have to be willing to fail. Sure, you're going to be afraid. I like what Mark Batterson says. Mark Batterson says that the antidote for the fear of failure is not success, but actually it's small doses of failure. You have to be willing to fail and realize it's not the end. God can actually teach you something. Remember, you try, you fail, you learn, and you adjust.
Dad, I'm in the stickle bat.
A lot of times when people visit a ministry that has it, they tend to think this ministry has the Midas touch. Whatever they do seems to work. But what they don't realize is that often what works was born out of something that didn't work. For example, we have many different campuses today that meet in all sorts of different states, and we connect them through the use of video teaching. What a lot of people don't know is that our very first attempt at a video venue failed. It didn't work. It's gone. It doesn't exist today. Years ago, our first attempt was a video experience that we called Avoda, where we tried to assemble people in a real different culture and use video teaching to reach more people. But it didn't work, and we know some reasons why it didn't work. And those reasons why it didn't work actually propelled us into the future to do things better today. We underestimated the value of great leadership in these venues. We also didn't see how to build community when using video. Another thing we underestimated was the value of high-quality video communication. And these learning experiences propelled us forward into the future, because often what works was born out of something that didn't work. Again, you try, you fail, you learn, you adjust. You try, you fail, you learn, and you adjust. Where are you going?
Yeah.
Well, you might be wondering, what do we do if we're a part of a ministry that is really afraid of failure, that we're just kind of frozen in time? Well, I'll give you a few thoughts that may be helpful to move you forward. The first thing I'd suggest is that you want to try to create a culture that allows for failure. You want your people to know that failure is not the worst thing that can happen. In fact, it's often a good thing. And you can do this in several different ways. One thing you can do is you can just call every new venture that you try, you can call it an experiment. You can say, we're just going to try and see what happens. And then that way it actually gives you kind of a safety net to say, well, if things didn't work out, well, that was an experiment, and we actually learned from the experiment. Another thing that you can do is just tell people, we are going to fail, but we're going to fail aggressively and not fail passively. Some ministries fail by doing nothing. We never want to fail by doing nothing. If we ever do fail, we want to fail on the side of doing anything short of sin to reach people who don't know Christ. We want to fail forward and never fail by just simply standing still. Another thing that's helped me personally is I've learned not to internalize failures. Just because I fail at something doesn't mean that I'm a failure. I failed at this, but this failure is not me. I'm not a failure. God is going to teach me something through this. You never internalize the failures. Then, whenever you try something, you want to make sure to debrief after it. You try something that works, well, why did it work? Why did it not work? You try something that didn't work. What can we learn from it? What can we do next time that's different? You want to debrief from everything that you do and learn everything you can. The most important thing is, don't give up. Man, God wants to do more through you than you could ever imagine. And the only thing standing between you and the next level of ministry success might be a failure that you need to have so God can teach you something or do something inside of you. Don't be afraid. Try, fail, learn, adjust, and try again.